Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita, Kansas government and public policy. We're broadcast on KGPT channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty, at wichitaliberty.org. The motto there is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. So I cover things that may not be covered by other news media in Wichita and Kansas, or if we do cover the same news, I'll cover it from the perspective of economic freedom, limited government, and individual liberty, because these are the things that are important. And these are also the things that we find so often under attack by our governments, be it at the federal, state, or local level. So please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter I send. You can like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, and if you want to contact me, my email address is easy to remember, bob.weeks@gmail.com. Well, why is this man smiling? Well, while serving as chair of the Wichita Metro Chamber of Commerce, he crafted a sweetheart deal for his company that was at the detriment of Wichita taxpayers. Now, in November 2013, the Wichita City Council granted an exemption from paying property tax and sales tax for High Touch Technologies, a company located in downtown Wichita. And this item was of more than usual interest as that company's chief executive officer, Wayne Chambers, well, he was about to become chair of the Wichita Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce. And at the same time, the city council voted to, he also voted to rent a High Touch up to 180 parking stalls in a garage at monthly rent of $35. These are located in the garage at 215 South Market at the corner of William. Now, the condition of that garage had deteriorated so much that it had been closed for several years. And then in March 2014, the Wichita City Council decided to rehabilitate the garage. And according to city documents, the cost to repair the garage is about $9.6 million, which creates 550 parking spaces. That works out to a cost of about $17,609 per parking spot. Now, so the question is this: who was the biggest beneficiary of this transaction? High Touch and its owners, or city taxpayers? Well, to evaluate real estate investments, a common metric is capitalization rate, or cap rate. And this formula simply divides the annual net operating income by the cost or value of the property. And for a single parking stall in this parking garage is rented to High Touch, the cap rate is 2.4%. Well, what does that number mean? What's the context? Is this a good or bad deal for Wichita taxpayers? Well, to answer this question, we need to find an appropriate capitalization rate. And in major cities, the cap rate for parking garages is, well, it's lower than for other types of real estate investment, perhaps 5%. Local sources in Wichita say the rate for Wichita parking garages might be higher at 7 or 8%, but there haven't been recent parking lot transactions to help gauge what the market wants for a cap rate for parking garages. But taxpayers may remember when the city evaluated the Union Station project in October, part of that was a parking garage, the city used a capitalization rate of 9%. That's the cap rate the city felt the investor deserved to earn, and that's the rate the city used to justify taxpayer subsidy. But on the 215 South Market Street garage, the city, on behalf of taxpayers, accepted a cap rate of just 2.4%. Now, what if the city wanted to earn a cap rate of 9% for taxpayers? Well, the annual rent for each parking stall would have to be $1,585 or $132 per month. And at a 7% cap rate, the monthly rent would be $103. But the city is renting the spaces for just $35, not $132 or $103. And it's actually a better deal for high touch and a correspondingly worse deal for city taxpayers than these numbers show. If high touch was to build a parking garage itself, it would encounter expenses such as insurance, lighting, cleaning and sweeping, repairs and maintenance, and security. Oh, and not to mention property taxes, which of course the city does not pay. But the city will pay all these other expenses except for insurance, as the city self-insures, but that doesn't mean that insurance is free. It still has an implicit cost that taxpayers bear. Well, all of these costs are contained in the $35 monthly rent the city will collect from high touch. So it's a great deal for high touch and a bad deal for city taxpayers. It also establishes a template whereby private sector developers are unlikely to develop parking in downtown Wichita when there's a competitor that can undercut their rates using taxpayer dollars to do so. Remember how I told you there are no recent parking lot transactions to help gauge what the market wants for capitalization rate in Wichita? Well, there's a reason for that. When the city offers parking spaces for $35, the private sector can't compete. Therefore, more economic activity moves to the government sphere and the private sector shrinks. By the way, in its coverage of the rehab of this garage, the Wichita Eagle didn't let taxpayers know how much high touch benefited from their contributions. The Eagle wrote nearly 1,200 words on this topic and published a large photograph, but it did not think it was necessary to present information like this. Or maybe newspaper reporters do not understand things like this. I really don't know. I should note, however, that the Wichita Eagle article was written by its business reporting staff. And here's what concerns me. When citizens do not know things like this, it leaves the door wide open for government to craft deals like this that are against the interests of taxpayers. And I wonder, do elected officials and bureaucrats have information like this when they make decisions on these issues? Certainly the cronies know what it would cost them to construct parking spaces for their employees or to rent them at market rates. Last week we talked about a continual problem in government, and that is that many of the actions that government takes have a tremendous benefit to a small group of people, but the cost is spread across the entire country or maybe just a state or city. So the cost then to any one person is usually small. Concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, we call it. The idea is that since the cost to any single person of a wasteful government program is small, people are not motivated to take action. But collectively, these costs add up to a lot of money. Collectively, these actions are worth the attention of citizens. But there's another problem, one that we've also talked about on Wichita Liberty TV. And that is many people, maybe even almost everyone, they receive some sort of government favor. It might be a tax break, a subsidy, a protective regulation, something like that. So how can I speak out against a special deal that someone else receives when I myself receive my own special benefit? And lawmakers, our legislators, they know that if they attack a special deal for one industry, well, then it will be difficult to gain support for their own special deals that they want passed. And they almost all have special deals they want passed. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. A request for correspondence belonging to a Kansas University faculty member is a blatant attempt to squelch academic freedom and free speech. Here's what's going on. When conservative groups have sought records of correspondence of liberal university professors, the American Association of University Professors has defended withholding the records based on academic freedom. That is, until the subject of a records request is a KU faculty member who believes in free markets and receives funding from the left's favorite target, Charles and David Koch. Then the local chapter of AAUP flips its position, and it will even contribute money against the ideal of academic freedom. So what is the American Association of University Professors? Well, it's a national group, the nation's premier organization for higher education faculty. Its mission statement lists a lot of things the group works for, but the first item listed is to advance economic freedom. And it has done that at the national level. In 2011, Republicans in Wisconsin requested the correspondence of a professor who was critical of American Legislative Exchange Council, a free market advocacy group. AAUP argued against releasing the records, writing, "We believe that disclosure of Professor Cronin's email correspondence will inevitably produce a chilling effect not only on Professor Cronin's academic freedom, but also on the academic freedom of the faculty colleges and faculty members, with potentially deleterious effects on the quality of research and teaching. We urge you to do what you can to resist complying with this outrageous request." And then in defense of a professor at the University of Virginia whose correspondence was sought by a conservative group, AAUP also defended academic freedom. I won't read to you the quotation that I used in my article at wichitaliberty.org, but it again mentioned significant risk of chilling academic freedom that FOIA requests may pose. It also said that a request for a professor's correspondence strikes at the heart of academic freedom and debate. Deleterious effects are predicted. FOIA, or FOIA, well, that's the Freedom of Information Act, which covers federal agencies. Most states have a similar law. In Kansas, it's called the Kansas Open Records Act. These laws grant access to records of governmental agencies, but they also have many exceptions, but that's a whole other issue. So AAUP has strongly advocated in favor of academic freedom when conservative groups have requested the correspondence of liberal university professors. These requests were outrageous and strike at the heart of academic freedom and debate. Oh, and don't forget the chilling effect. Well, but that's not the case in Kansas. When a KU student group requested correspondence of KU lecturer Art Hall, the local chapter of AAUP flipped its stance regarding academic freedom. It even contributed money towards the cost of the records requests. Now, the political motivation of AAUP and the student group that filed the request cannot be overlooked. The primary subject of the request for correspondence is Dr. Arthur P. Hall. He is a lecturer in the KU School of Business and also director of its Center for Applied Economics. He believes in free markets and academic freedom. He won an award for his teaching of MBA students earlier this year. He testifies to the Kansas legislature against rent-sinking and crony capitalism. Hall and the Center also received funding from the Fred and Mary Koch Foundation. And Dr. Hall appeared on Wichita Liberty TV in September. You may remember we talked about issues relating to the proposed sales tax in Wichita, but also about an innovative idea he had about how Wichita could secure an expanded water supply through market purchases of water. Okay, so why did the local chapter of AAUP depart from the national stance of AAUP regarding the correspondence of university faculty members? Well, did you catch a name I mentioned a moment ago? That name is Koch. Art Hall was chief economist in the public affairs group of Wichita-based Koch Industries. He believes, as do Charles and David Koch, in free markets and economic freedom. And that's what stirs up suspicion and opposition. It doesn't matter that around the world we found that free markets and economic freedom create better living conditions for everyone. It doesn't matter that disclosure of email correspondence has a chilling effect, remember, on academic freedom. As long as a political attack on Koch Industries can be advanced, well, anything is fair game, and principles no longer apply. Here in Kansas, the request for Hall's correspondence was made by a student named Skylar Krause. She's president of the student group Students for a Sustainable Future. Members of SSF have ties to groups like Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, and PowerShift. SSF advertised that members will have networking opportunities with these groups and others like Forecast the Future, Kansas Interfaith Power and Light, and a few more. All of these groups have mounted political attacks on Charles and David Koch for years. SFF also listed as an advisor Manny Abarca, who is Recycling Operations Coordinator for KU, as well as Community Affairs Liaison for Emmanuel Cleaver, the Democratic congressman from Kansas City, Missouri. Prior to that, he worked for United States Senator Claire McCaskill. So this is a political group with a definite political agenda, and that's fine. But let's make sure we understand that SSF is a group with a leftist political agenda, a group that is opposed to things like capitalism, property rights, and free markets. Now, when KU told SSF that requests for Hall's records would cost $1,800, well, the organization was able to raise that amount quickly, aided by a $1,000 contribution from the Kansas chapter of AAUP. Yeah, that's the local chapter of the national group that opposes release of the correspondence of liberal professors. By the way, for a student group, SFF seems to have access to quite a bit of funds, at one time offering to pay students $12.50 per hour for political work. So why would the Kansas chapter of AAUP attack academic freedom in the case of Hall's correspondence, while at the national level AAUP defends academic freedom? Well, as Dr. Hall wrote in an op-ed, he said, with the odd exception of the Kansas chapter, which reportedly provided funding to the student group seeking my private documents, the AAUP has consistently stood by professors and researchers in shielding their private correspondence from overreaching records requests, acknowledging the threat that this kind of activity poses to academic freedom. So, this episode shows that the left views academic freedom much like it does free speech. The political left will defend free speech and academic freedom at any cost, as long as they agree with what is being said and taught. The political left can't tolerate the marketplace of ideas that Charles and David Koch support, even when it's just one faculty member at a large university school. That, quite simply, is the reason for the request made to KU for Dr. Hall's correspondence. By harassing certain faculty in the university, the left thinks it can shut down speech from people whose words and ideas it doesn't like. Yes, the political left says it values free speech and open scientific and economic inquiry, but it mounts attacks like this on those who don't conform to the liberal orthodoxy present at most universities. Well, in a message to his fellow School of Business faculty, Dr. Hall explained that he has nothing to hide regarding his correspondence. He expressed concern, however, that political opponents might cherry-pick language from hundreds of emails in order to weave a story. Well, that sword cuts both ways. The university should not acquiesce quietly to this attempt to silence one of its faculty. It should not set a precedent that conservatives might justifiably cite when requesting correspondence of liberal faculty members. Well, as of today, the status of this case is that a judge granted Hall's request to block the release of the correspondence. This is a temporary measure, and there will surely be more negotiations or litigation before long. And I hope that KU, the university that I graduated from, will stand up for economic freedom. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Our city and state is full of authoritarians. We have conservatives who are in favor of low taxes, usually, but insist on regulating who may marry and what types of recreation you may engage in. We have liberals who express concern for the community and the people, but who also thought taxing poor people more on their food in order to give more money to wealthy downtown developers, that was a good idea. They also think it's a good idea for low-income households to pay higher water bills so that people can have rebates on new toilets. And both of these groups generally want to plan an increasing share of your life for you. In Wichita, there is usually little opposition to things like regulating who may paint stripes on parking lots, or regulating the dress and personal hygiene of taxicab drivers, dictating where food trucks may park and operate, and what the maximum capacity should be for a coffee shop. And if you have a big Sharpie like this, you need to be careful to stay 100 feet away from any public facility, park, playground, swimming pool, skate park, recreational facility, or other public building owned or operated by the city, county, state, or federal government. You also need to stay 100 feet away from any underpass, bridge, abutment, storm, drain, spillway, or similar type of infrastructure unless you've received authorization. Yeah, our city leaders assume that if you do any of these things, you have some sort of criminal activity planned. These, of course, are just some of the small areas that government regulates. For the really big things in Wichita, like who will receive taxpayer subsidy for conforming to government's plans for economic development, there is rarely any disagreement at City Hall that there should be more regulation, more taxation, and more subsidy. You've heard me talk about libertarianism as a way to break out of this trap. Well, this video by Nigel Ashford of the Institute for Humane Studies explains the tenets of classical liberalism, which is to say, libertarianism. It provides a way to run a society based on liberty and individualism rather than control and collectivism, which is what we have now.
What is classical liberalism? It's a set of ideas that places the freedom of the individual as its central feature. Classical liberals disagree about many things, but they agree, I think, on 10 core principles. Number one is that liberty is the primary political value. We all have lots of different values. We care about our family, our church. But when it comes to deciding what to do politically, what should the government do, classical liberals have one clear standard. Does this increase or does it reduce the freedom of the individual? The government should only act to prevent harm to others. Second principle, individualism. That the individual is more important than the collective. We should not sacrifice the interests of individuals for what some people argue is the common good. This was the central feature of communism and fascism. The individuals didn't matter. Every individual matters. Every individual is worthy of respect. Third principle, skepticism about power. Power is the ability to get other people to do what you want that otherwise they would not do. Government, for example, often claims we're forcing you to do X because it's in your own interest to do so. Whereas very often, when people with power do that, it's really because it's good for themselves. Classical liberals believe that the individual is the best judge of their own interests. We can try and recommend things, but in the end, the individual is the best judge of their own interests. Other people should not force them to do things that they do not want to do. Fourth, the rule of law. This is the idea that there's some higher principles by which we should examine what government does, laws that are passed, government actions. Just like the US Supreme Court will sometimes strike down pieces of legislation that Congress has passed and the President has signed because it goes against certain principles embodied in the US Constitution. Classical liberals believe that certain principles of the rule of law should be applied to what every government does anywhere in the world. A classic example is equality before the law. People should be treated the same regardless of their race or gender or sexual orientation. That's why classical liberals have always objected to the idea that there should be laws that treat, say, blacks and whites differently. 5. Civil society. Civil society are those voluntary organisations that exist between the individual and the state. Classical liberals believe that most social problems can be more effectively dealt with through these voluntary organisations like the family, like the church, like charitable organisations, because they have the knowledge about the individuals in which they're dealing with. Civil society is much more effective than government bureaucracies and inflexible rules that can't change depending on people's individual circumstances. So the civil society can do many of the things that we now look to for the welfare state to do. 6. Spontaneous order. Order, it means the existence of regularity and predictability in the world. When people are making decisions about what to do, they need to be able to predict what the results of making those decisions should be. Many people seem to assume that order requires some institution, some body to manipulate and organise things. Classical liberals don't believe that. They believe that order can arise spontaneously. People, through their voluntary interaction, create the rules by which people can live by. Classic example is that of language. Nobody invented the English language. It arose in terms of people communicating with each other, and yet certain rules have applied through that process. We don't need people to plan our lives. 7. Free markets. That economic exchange should be left to voluntary activity between individuals. Government should not tell people where to work, how to save, what to build, what to produce. This should be led to voluntary interaction by people. You need private property to be able to do that, and you need to ensure that when there is disputes, they can be peacefully resolved. But history shows us is that leaving things to free markets rather than government planning or organisation increases prosperity, reduces poverty, increases jobs, provides goods that people want to buy. 8. Toleration. Toleration is the belief that one should not interfere with things of which one disapproves. Toleration does not mean that you allow people to do things because you agree with it, because you think it's a good thing. It's a question of having certain moral principles. I think this action is wrong, but I will not try and force my opinions, for example, through government, to stop the things that I disapprove of. A classic case of that for classical liberals is free speech. People should be allowed to say things of which we strongly disapprove. We're tolerating things even though we dislike and disapprove it. 9. Peace. Peace is a state where we can go about our business without violence or war. That's best achieved, according to classical liberals, is not by interfering in other countries. In other words, they favour a non-interventionist foreign policy. Their view in terms of our interaction with other nations, it should be based on what's commonly called the 4 freedoms. There should be free movement of capital and labour, people, goods and services. And I would add something as well, the free movement of ideas. If we have a world in which this free movement is embraced, then I think we'll have a world, and classical liberals believe, we would have a world based on peace. And finally, limited government. That there are very few things on which the government should do. The goal of the government is simply to protect a life, liberty and property. Anything beyond that is not justifiable. A strictly limited government. So these are the 10 principles of classical liberalism. Are you a classical liberal?